In the 14th century, King Edward III of England ruled a realm at war and a palace full of children, 12 in all, born to Queen Philippa of Hainault. Knights, princes, and princesses filled the corridors of Windsor and Woodstock. Some would command armies, some would marry into foreign thrones, and others would die before they could walk. From the Black Prince who conquered France to the youngest, Thomas of Woodstock, whose rebellion shook the crown itself, their stories form a single family tree whose branches still reach into today's royal bloodlines. In the next hour, we'll trace each life from cradle to legacy and find out whatever happened to all the children of Edward III. Edward III reigned England from 1327 to 1377, 50 years that transformed a kingdom into an empire. His wars with France brought glory and gold. His court at Windsor became the jewel of chivalric Europe. His marriage to Philippa of Hainault proved both politically astute and personally fulfilling. Between 1330 and 1355, Queen Philippa bore 12 children who survived to be christened. Each child represented both dynastic security and diplomatic opportunity. Sons could inherit thrones or found new noble houses. Daughters could seal alliances through marriage. Together, they formed the most influential royal generation in English history. Edward III understood the value of his offspring. He granted his sons duchies that had never existed before, Lancaster, York, Gloucester. He negotiated marriages for his daughters with the great houses of Europe. He prepared his eldest, Edward of Woodstock, to inherit a crown that would rule from Scotland to Gascony. Yet time would prove that royal blood carries both privilege and peril. Some of these children would die as infants, mourned in Westminster Abbey and York Minster. Others would live to old age, founding dynasties that would tear England apart in civil war. Still others would marry abroad and disappear from English history altogether. The story of Edward III's children is the story of medieval monarchy itself, how a single royal nursery could determine the fate of nations for centuries to come. Each child's life, however brief, left its mark on the tapestry of English kingship. Their descendants would claim crowns, led rebellions, and reshaped the very meaning of royal legitimacy. Today, more than 6 centuries later, their blood still flows through the House of Windsor and the royal families of Europe. The children of Edward III did not merely live and die, they became the foundation upon which all future English dynasties would build. Edward of Woodstock was born at Woodstock Palace on June 15, 1330, the first son of King Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainault. His birth secured the Plantagenet succession and gave England an heir who would become the most celebrated soldier of his age. The prince received the finest education medieval Europe could provide. He learned Latin, French, and the arts of war. His tutors included the greatest knights of the realm. By age 10, he was already present at court ceremonies, learning the rituals of kingship that would one day be his responsibility. At 16, Edward of Woodstock fought his first battle at Crécy in 1346. French chroniclers later claimed that English archers won the day, but the prince led the charge that broke the French cavalry. His father watched from a hill as the heir apparent proved himself worthy of the crown he would inherit. The victory at Crécy marked the beginning of a military career that would span 3 decades. The prince's greatest triumph came at Poitiers in 1356. Leading an army deep into French territory, he encountered a force 3 times larger under King John II of France. The battle seemed hopeless, until the prince executed a brilliant flanking maneuver that shattered the French lines. When the dust settled, the King of France himself was a prisoner, destined for the Tower of London. The ransom alone would finance English campaigns for years to come. His contemporaries called him the Black Prince, though the origin of this name remains disputed. Some claim it referred to his black armor, others to his ruthless campaigns in southern France. Whatever the source, the title captured his reputation as England's most formidable warrior prince. In 1361, Edward of Woodstock married his cousin Joan of Kent, already twice widowed and bearing children from her previous marriages. The union shocked European courts. Princes typically married for diplomatic advantage, not affection. Yet the marriage proved happy, producing 2 sons, Edward of Angoulême, who died in childhood, and Richard of Bordeaux, born in 1367. The prince's final campaign took him to Spain. supporting Pedro the Cruel's claim to the throne of Castile. The expedition succeeded militarily but ruined the prince's health and finances. The Spanish climate and constant warfare left him chronically ill. He returned to England in 1371 as heir apparent to a throne he would never occupy. Edward of Woodstock died at Westminster Palace on June 8, 1376, 1 year before his father. He was 45 years old, worn down by decades of campaign and illness. His death created a succession crisis that would haunt England for generations. The crown passed not to an experienced prince, but to his 10-year-old son Richard, setting the stage for political upheaval. The Black Prince's legacy lived on through his son Richard II, who ruled England from 1377 to 1399. Richard's reign began with peasant revolts and ended with his deposition by Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt. The direct line of Edward of Woodstock died with Richard II in Pontefract Castle, murdered or starved by his usurper cousin. Though his line ended in tragedy, Edward of Woodstock had established the template for English warrior kingship. His victories in France, his chivalric reputation, and his early death created a legend that would inspire English princes for centuries. The Black Prince's tomb in Canterbury Cathedral became a shrine to military valor and royal devotion. His story reminds us that royal blood guarantees neither a crown nor a dynasty. The greatest soldier prince in English history left only a child to inherit his father's throne, and that child could not hold what his grandfather and father had built. Yet the legend of the Black Prince endured, proof that sometimes reputation outlives both life and lineage. Isabella of England was born in 1332, the eldest daughter of Edward III and Queen Philippa. As the king's second child but first daughter, she became a valuable diplomatic asset in her father's continental ambitions. Isabella grew up in the royal nurseries at Windsor and Woodstock, receiving the education appropriate for a medieval princess. She learned French, Latin, music, and the courtly arts. Her tutors prepared her for marriage to a foreign prince, understanding that royal daughters were living treaties between kingdoms. In 1345, when Isabella was 13, Edward III arranged her betrothal to Louis de Malles, heir to the county of Flanders. The match would have secured English wool trade routes and created an alliance against France. However, French pressure forced Louis to abandon the engagement, leaving Isabella available for other diplomatic arrangements. The king turned his attention to France itself. In 1365, Isabella married Enguerrand de Coucy, Earl of Bedford, a French nobleman who had been captured at the Battle of Crécy and subsequently entered English service. The marriage represented both personal preference and political calculation. Coucy brought French territorial claims that supported Edward III's continental ambitions. Isabella's marriage proved happier than many royal unions of the period. She and Enguerrand established their household between England and France, maintaining estates in both kingdoms. Their wealth allowed them to patronize arts and letters, making their court a center of Anglo-French culture during the later 14th century. The couple had two daughters, Marie de Coucy, born in 1366, and Philippa de Coucy, born in 1367. Both daughters married into French nobility, carrying English royal blood into continental aristocracy. Through these marriages, Isabella's descendants became integrated into French noble society rather than remaining connected to English royal succession. Isabella's later life was marked by the complex loyalties created by her marriage. When the 100 Years' War resumed under Richard II, she found herself torn between her English birth and her French marriage. Enguerrand maintained his French allegiances while serving English interests, a delicate balance that required constant diplomatic skill. Isabella died in 1382 at approximately 50 years of age. She was buried in France, reflecting the continental life she had chosen through marriage. Her death marked the end of her direct connection to English royal politics, though her bloodline continued through her French descendants. Her daughters maintained their father's French orientation. Marie de Coucy married Henry of Bar and became part of the complex web of French noble houses that would dominate continental politics into the 15th century. Philippa de Coucy married Robert de Vere, though this marriage produced no surviving children. Isabella's story illustrates the typical fate of medieval royal daughters: marriage as diplomatic instruments, lives divided between birth country and adopted homeland, descendants absorbed into foreign nobility. Unlike her brothers, who founded English duchies and influenced domestic politics for generations, Isabella's legacy lay in strengthening ties between English and French aristocracy. Her bloodline contributed to the complex genealogical claims that would fuel the Hundred Years' War's later phases. French nobles could trace descent from Edward III through Isabella's daughters, adding another layer to the dynastic disputes that plagued both kingdoms throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. While her brothers' names echo through English history, Isabella of England represents the quieter but equally important role of royal women in medieval diplomacy. Her marriage created personal bonds across national boundaries, her household fostered cultural exchange, and her daughters carried English royal blood into the heart of French noble society. Joan of England was born in 1335, the third child and second daughter of Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainault. Her brief life embodied both the diplomatic ambitions and tragic uncertainties of medieval royal childhood. Joan received the education typical of royal daughters in the 14th century. She learned French, Latin, music, and needlework in the royal nurseries at Windsor Castle. Her tutors prepared her for marriage to a foreign prince, understanding that her primary value lay in cementing political alliances for her father's realm. Edward III recognized Joan's potential diplomatic importance early in her life. By 1345, when she was only 10 years old, negotiations were already underway for her marriage to Pedro, heir to the throne of Castile. The proposed match would have secured English influence in Iberian politics and provided support for English claims in southwestern France. The betrothal to Pedro represented Edward III's grand strategy for encircling France with English allies. Castile controlled crucial Atlantic sea routes and possessed a formidable navy that could threaten French shipping. A marriage alliance would transform potential enemies into committed partners in the continuing struggle against the Valois monarchy. Preparations for Joan's departure began in 1348 when she reached the age of 13. Medieval custom dictated that royal brides should be old enough to bear children immediately after marriage, ensuring the swift production of heirs to cement dynastic alliances. Joan's household was assembled, her dowry calculated, and her journey to Castile planned with elaborate ceremony. The wedding party departed England in late summer 1348, traveling overland through France under safe conduct from King Philip VI. The journey proceeded smoothly until the convoy reached Bordeaux, where Joan and her retinue planned to rest before the final journey into Castilian territory. Disaster struck without warning. The Black Death, which had been ravaging Europe since 1347, reached Bordeaux just as Joan's party arrived. The plague killed indiscriminately, striking down nobles and commoners, adults and children, with terrifying efficiency. Within days of reaching the city, Joan fell ill with the characteristic symptoms of bubonic plague. Joan of England died in Bordeaux in September 1348 at the age of 13. She was buried in the city's cathedral, far from the royal tombs of Westminster Abbey. Her death shocked both English and Castilian courts, demonstrating that royal blood offered no protection against the pandemic that was transforming medieval Europe. The diplomatic consequences of Joan's death extended far beyond personal tragedy. The marriage alliance with Castile collapsed, forcing Edward III to seek alternative arrangements for Iberian support. Pedro of Castile eventually married Maria de Padilla instead, leading to succession disputes that would complicate Spanish politics for decades. Joan's story became part of the larger narrative of the Black Death's impact on royal dynasties. The pandemic killed approximately 1/3 of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351, disrupting not only peasant communities but also the carefully planned marriage networks that sustained medieval diplomacy. Her brief life illustrates the precarious nature of medieval royal childhood. Despite the privileges of rank, royal children faced the same diseases, accidents, and uncertainties that threatened all medieval families. Joan's death reminded contemporaries that dynasty planning required not only political skill, but also luck in the face of forces beyond human control. The princess left no direct legacy beyond her tomb in Bordeaux Cathedral. No children carried her blood forward, no marriage alliance bore diplomatic fruit. Yet her story remains significant as a reminder of paths not taken, alliances not formed, and the role of mortality in shaping the course of royal history. Joan of England's death marked one of Edward III's first major losses, foreshadowing later tragedies that would claim other children before they could fulfill their dynastic destinies. Her memory survived in royal chronicles as evidence of both royal ambition and royal vulnerability in an age when death could strike princes as easily as peasants. William of Hatfield was born in early 1337, the fourth child and second son of Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainault. His birth brought joy to the royal court, providing a second male heir to secure the Plantagenet succession should anything happen to his elder brother Edward of Woodstock. The prince was born at Hatfield Palace in Hertfordshire, a favorite residence of Queen Philippa during her later pregnancies. The palace provided a quiet retreat from the ceremonial demands of Windsor and Westminster, allowing the queen to recover from childbirth surrounded by her closest attendants and physicians. William's baptism took place with appropriate royal ceremony, though records of the event remain sparse compared to the elaborate documentation surrounding his elder brother's birth. The king and queen clearly hoped that their second son would grow to provide additional security for the dynasty, either as a spare heir or as the founder of a new noble house. Medieval infant mortality struck indiscriminately across all social classes, and royal children enjoyed little advantage over common families when facing the diseases and accidents that claimed young lives. Despite the best medical care available in the 14th century, William of Hatfield fell ill before his first birthday. The exact cause of William's death remains unknown to historians. Medieval medical records rarely specified the diseases that killed children, typically recording only that infants died of fever or succumbed to unspecified illnesses. The royal physicians likely tried every remedy known to contemporary medicine, but their treatments proved ineffective against whatever condition afflicted the young prince. William of Hatfield died in 1337, probably before reaching his first birthday. His death represented the first significant loss experienced by Edward III and Queen Philippa, foreshadowing later tragedies that would claim more of their children before maturity. The royal couple grieved privately while maintaining public composure expected of monarchs. The prince was buried in York Minster, demonstrating the respect accorded even to infant members of the royal family. His tomb, though modest compared to monuments erected for adult royalty, marked his place in the Plantagenet line and preserved his memory for future generations. The burial at York rather than Westminster may have reflected practical considerations of geography or personal preferences of his parents. William's brief existence illustrates the harsh realities of medieval childhood, even within royal households. Despite every advantage of rank, wealth, and medical attention, royal infants faced the same vulnerabilities that threatened all children in an age before modern medicine. His death reminded the court that dynasty building required not only strategic marriages and political alliances, but also simple biological luck. The loss of their second son may have influenced Edward III's subsequent decisions about his surviving children. The king became increasingly concerned with securing multiple lines of succession, eventually creating new duchies for his younger sons to ensure that the Plantagenet bloodline would survive even if the direct royal line faced difficulties. William of Hatfield left no legacy beyond his tomb and his place in royal genealogies. No descendants carried his name forward, no noble house claimed him as founder, no political alliance hinged on his survival. Yet his brief life and early death shaped his parents' understanding of royal mortality and influenced their treatment of their surviving children. His story serves as a reminder that medieval royal families, despite their privileges and power, remained vulnerable to forces beyond their control. Disease, accident, and death could strike royal nurseries as easily as peasant cottages, making every surviving child more precious and every successful succession more remarkable. The memory of William of Hatfield survived primarily in the careful records kept by royal chroniclers, who documented births and deaths within the royal family as matters of national importance. His name appears in genealogical tables as evidence of Edward III's fertility and as a reminder of the losses that accompanied medieval royal parenthood. Lionel of Antwerp was born on November 29, 1338, in Antwerp, the fifth child and third son of Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainault. His birth in the Low Countries reflected his parents' diplomatic mission to secure continental alliances against France, making him the only one of Edward III's children born outside England. The prince received his name from both his birthplace and the Lion of England, symbolizing his dual connection to English royalty and continental politics. His upbringing took place primarily at Windsor and Woodstock, where he received the military and administrative education appropriate for a royal son expected to govern territories and lead armies. Lionel grew to exceptional height for his era, earning him the nickname Lionel the Giant among contemporary chroniclers. His physical presence matched his political importance as Edward III began planning territorial assignments for his surviving sons. The king recognized that younger sons needed independent power bases to support the crown while avoiding succession disputes. In 1352, Edward III arranged Lionel's marriage to Elizabeth de Burgh, heiress to the earldom of Ulster and vast estates throughout Ireland. The marriage served multiple purposes. It brought Irish revenues into royal control, provided Lionel with independent wealth, and established English royal presence in Ireland's turbulent political landscape. The marriage to Elizabeth proved both politically successful and personally compatible. She brought enormous wealth to the match, including lands in Ireland, Wales, and England that made Lionel one of the wealthiest nobles in the realm. Their combined resources allowed them to maintain a magnificent household and patronize scholars, artists, and religious institutions. In 1361, Edward III created Lionel as Duke of Clarence, the first person to hold this title in English history. The elevation reflected both Lionel's successful administration of his Irish territories and his father's systematic creation of new duchies for royal sons. The title of Clarence derived from Clare, one of Elizabeth's ancestral holdings. Lionel's primary responsibility became governing Ireland as the king's lieutenant. He crossed the Irish Sea multiple times between 1361 and 1368, attempting to establish effective royal authority over the fractious Irish lordships. His efforts met with mixed success. He could impose temporary peace through military force, but lasting settlement proved elusive. The couple had one child, Philippa of Clarence, born in 1355. Her birth ensured continuation of Lionel's line, though medieval inheritance law complicated her position as a female heir. Philippa would later become one of the most important women in English dynastic history, though her significance remained hidden during her father's lifetime. Elizabeth de Burgh died in 1363, leaving Lionel a widower with a young daughter. Her death deprived him of both a beloved wife and the primary source of his wealth and authority. The earldom of Ulster passed to Philippa, though actual control of Irish estates required constant military enforcement against local resistance. In 1368, Edward III arranged Lionel's second marriage to Violante Visconti, daughter of Galeazzo II Visconti of Milan. The match represented English diplomatic outreach to northern Italy, seeking allies against French influence in papal politics. The marriage also brought Lionel additional wealth and continental connections. Lionel traveled to Italy for his wedding, which took place in Milan with unprecedented magnificence. The Visconti family spared no expense in demonstrating their new alliance with English royalty. The celebrations lasted for weeks, featuring tournaments, feasts, and artistic performances that impressed even the sophisticated Italian court. The marriage proved brief. Lionel of Antwerp died in Alba, Piedmont, on October 17, 1368, barely 5 months after his wedding. He was only 29 years old. Contemporary sources suggested poison, though modern historians consider disease or accident more likely causes. His death shocked both English and Italian courts. Lionel was buried in Pavia, far from the royal tombs of Westminster Abbey. His death ended English diplomatic initiatives in northern Italy and left his young daughter Philippa as sole heir to his vast estates and claims. The Duchy of Clarence technically became extinct with his death, though his daughter inherited his blood claim. Philippa of Clarence became the key to Lionel's lasting historical importance. She married Edmund Mortimer, 3rd Earl of March, carrying her father's royal blood into a family that would later claim the English throne itself. Through complex inheritance laws, the Mortimer line argued that Philippa's descent from Lionel gave them superior claim to the crown compared to the House of Lancaster. The Mortimer claim would eventually pass to the House of York through Philippa's great-granddaughter Anne Mortimer, who married Richard of Conisburgh, son of Edmund of Langley. This connection provided Edward IV and Richard III with their genealogical justification for overthrowing the Lancastrian kings during the Wars of the Roses. Lionel's legacy thus extends far beyond his personal achievements in Ireland and Italy. Through his daughter Philippa, his bloodline became central to the dynastic disputes that tore England apart in the 15th century. The gentle giant who died young in Italy became, posthumously, the ancestor of some of England's most controversial kings. His story demonstrates how medieval royal children could influence history long after their deaths through their descendants' claims and ambitions. Lionel of Antwerp lived only 30 years, but his blood provided legal justification for rebellion, civil war, and the eventual triumph of the House of York over the House of Lancaster. John of Gaunt was born on March 6, 1340 in Ghent, the sixth child and fourth son of Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainault. His birth during one of his parents' diplomatic missions to Flanders earned him the name of Gaunt, the English rendering of Ghent, marking him as another continental-born prince in Edward III's growing family. The prince received the comprehensive education appropriate for a royal son expected to play major roles in government and warfare. He mastered Latin, French, military arts, and statecraft under the guidance of England's finest tutors. His intellectual abilities matched his physical prowess, making him one of the most accomplished members of his generation. John's early military career began in France, where he served alongside his brothers in Edward III's later campaigns of the 100 Years' War. He demonstrated courage in battle and skill in command, earning respect from veteran soldiers and establishing his reputation as a capable military leader worthy of independent command responsibilities. In 1359, John married Blanche of Lancaster, daughter and co-heiress of Henry of Gaunt, first Duke of Lancaster. The marriage transformed John from a younger royal son into one of England's wealthiest and most powerful nobles. Blanche brought him vast estates across England and the claim to the Duchy of Lancaster. The marriage proved both politically advantageous and personally happy. Blanche and John established a magnificent household that became a center of culture and learning. They patronized scholars, poets, and artists, most notably Geoffrey Chaucer, who served in John's household and later wrote commemorative poetry about Blanche's beauty and virtue. When Henry of Gaunt died in 1361, John inherited his titles and estates through his wife's claim. Edward III created John as Duke of Lancaster in 1362, making him the wealthiest noble in England after the crown itself. The Lancastrian inheritance included not only English estates but also claims in France that would shape John's later ambitions. John and Blanche had 3 surviving children: Philippa, born in 1360, who would marry John I of Portugal, Elizabeth, born in 1363, who became a nun, and Henry Bolingbroke, born in 1367, who would eventually seize the English crown as Henry IV. Henry's birth provided the House of Lancaster with its future claimant to royal succession. Tragedy struck in 1368 when Blanche died, probably of plague, leaving John a widower with 3 young children. Her death devastated John personally and complicated his political position, as his authority over the vast Lancaster inheritance depended partly on his marriage to the Duke's daughter and heir. In 1371, John made a controversial second marriage to Constance of Castile, daughter of the murdered king Pedro the Cruel. The match was purely political, designed to support John's claim to the throne of Castile through his wife's inheritance. Edward III endorsed the marriage as part of English strategy to establish influence in Iberian politics. The Castilian marriage brought John a royal title but little practical benefit. He styled himself King of Castile and Leon, though his actual authority extended no further than his English estates. The marriage produced one child, Catherine, born in 1372, who would later marry Henry III of Castile, ironically strengthening the very dynasty her father claimed to replace. During Richard II's minority, John of Gaunt emerged as the dominant figure in English politics. His wealth, experience, and royal blood made him the natural leader of the Regency Council, though his authority faced constant challenges from other nobles and from popular resentment of his policies and taxation. John's political prominence made him a target for criticism during England's military and economic difficulties in the 1370s and 1380s. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 specifically targeted his properties and person, forcing him to flee London while rebels destroyed his Palace of Savoy and demanded his execution for alleged treason. Despite political setbacks, John maintained a parallel personal relationship with Catherine Swynford, his children's governess, who became his mistress and eventually his third wife. Their relationship scandalized contemporary moralists but produced 4 children, the Beauforts, who would play crucial roles in later English history through their descendants. In 1386, John launched his long-planned expedition to claim the throne of Castile by force. The campaign initially succeeded, with John occupying much of northern Spain and receiving recognition from several Spanish nobles. However, resistance proved stronger than expected, and the costs of maintaining an army in Spain quickly exhausted even John's vast resources. John abandoned his Castilian ambitions in 1387, accepting a financial settlement from the ruling Trastamara dynasty in exchange for renouncing his royal claims. He returned to England having spent enormous sums for minimal gain, though the expedition had at least removed him from domestic politics during a period of particular instability. The 1390s saw John's gradual rehabilitation in English politics. Richard II, now ruling in his own right, recognized the value of his uncle's experience and wealth. John served as a moderating influence between the king and the nobility, using his diplomatic skills to prevent conflicts that might have led to civil war. In 1396, John's political rehabilitation was completed when Richard II granted him permission to legitimize his Beaufort children through marriage to Catherine Swynford. The wedding took place at Lincoln Cathedral, making Catherine a duchess and the Beaufort children legitimate members of the royal family, though specifically barred from royal succession. John of Gaunt died at Leicester Castle on February 3, 1399, at the age of 58. His death removed the most powerful stabilizing force in Richard II's government, creating a power vacuum that his son Henry Bolingbroke would soon exploit to seize the crown for the House of Lancaster. The immediate consequence of John's death was the Lancastrian usurpation of 1399. When Richard II attempted to seize the Lancastrian inheritance, Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile to claim his father's estates. The dispute escalated rapidly, culminating in Richard's deposition and Henry's coronation as Henry IV, the first Lancastrian king. John's legacy extended far beyond his son's usurpation. Through Henry IV, the House of Lancaster would rule England until 1461, producing the warrior king Henry V and the troubled reign of Henry VI. The Lancastrian claim to legitimacy rested entirely on descent from John of Gaunt, making him the founder of a royal dynasty. The Beaufort line proved equally significant in English history. Though barred from direct succession, the Beauforts married into the highest nobility and eventually produced Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry Tudor. When Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field in 1485, he claimed the throne, partly through his descent from John of Gaunt's legitimized children. John of Gaunt's bloodline thus produced both the Lancastrian kings who ruled England from 1399 to 1461, and the Tudor monarchs who ruled from 1485 to 1603. Through the Tudors, his descendant Elizabeth I became England's greatest queen, and through the Tudors' Scottish marriage connections, his blood flows through every subsequent English and British monarch. The fourth son of Edward III became, through his descendants, the ancestor of more English kings than any other medieval noble. His wealth, ambition, and fertility combined to create a dynasty that would dominate English politics for more than 2 centuries and establish bloodline connections that continue to the present day. Edmund of Langley was born on June 5, 1341, at King's Langley in Hertfordshire, the 7th child and 5th son of Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainault. His birth at the royal manor that would give him his surname marked the beginning of a life that would establish one of medieval England's most enduring noble houses. The prince received the standard education for royal sons, learning Latin, French, military skills, and the arts of governance. However, as a younger son with 4 elder brothers, Edmund was never expected to inherit the crown or play a leading role in royal government. His destiny lay in founding a cadet branch of the royal house to provide support and stability for the monarchy. Edmund's early military career followed the pattern established by his elder brothers. He served in Edward III's French campaigns, learning warfare alongside experienced commanders and proving his competence in battle. Though he never achieved the legendary status of his brother the Black Prince, Edmund earned respect as a reliable military leader. In 1372, Edward III arranged Edmund's marriage to Isabella of Castile, daughter of King Pedro the Cruel and sister of Constance, who had married John of Gaunt the previous year. The match served English diplomatic interest by strengthening claims to Castilian territory while providing Edmund with royal blood and potential inheritance rights in Spain. The marriage brought Edmund both opportunities and complications. Isabella's royal ancestry elevated his status among European nobility, but her family's turbulent history in Castilian politics created ongoing diplomatic entanglements. The couple established their household primarily in England, though they maintained awareness of Spanish developments throughout their marriage. In 1385, Edward III created Edmund as Duke of York, establishing a new ducal title that would become one of England's premier noble dignities. The creation reflected the king's systematic elevation of his sons to ducal rank and his desire to establish multiple branches of the royal family with independent power bases and resources. Edmund and Isabella had 3 children who survived to adulthood. Edward of Norwich, born around 1373, would inherit the York title and play a significant role in early 15th century politics. Richard of Konigsberg was born around 1375, receiving the title Earl of Cambridge and founding a line that would ultimately claim the English crown. Constance of York, born around 1374, would marry Thomas le Despencer and connect the York line to other noble families. The Duke of York's political career was characterized by loyalty to the crown and avoidance of the factional conflicts that consumed many of his contemporaries. Unlike his brothers, who often found themselves in opposition to royal policy or involved in bitter disputes with other nobles, Edmund maintained consistent support for legitimate royal authority throughout his life. During Richard II's troubled reign, Edmund served as a moderating voice among the royal uncles, attempting to balance competing interests and prevent conflicts that might threaten royal stability. His diplomatic skills proved valuable during the crisis of 1388, when the Lords Appellant challenged royal authority and executed several of Richard's favorites. Edmund's loyalty to Richard II created difficulties after Henry Bolingbroke's usurpation in 1399. As one of Richard's most consistent supporters, the Duke of York faced suspicion from the new Lancastrian regime. However, his reputation for honorable conduct and his kinship with Henry IV ultimately protected him from serious retribution. The transition to Lancastrian rule forced Edmund to navigate complex loyalties between his deposed nephew Richard II and his usurper nephew Henry IV. He chose pragmatic accommodation with the new regime while maintaining dignity and avoiding involvement in conspiracies that might have compromised his family's position. Edmund of Langley died at King's Langley on August 1, 1402, at the age of 61. He was buried at the collegiate church he had founded at his birthplace, establishing a family mausoleum that would eventually house several dukes of York. His death passed the ducal title to his elder son Edward, who would face far greater political challenges. The first Duke of York's immediate legacy lay in establishing the House of York as a major force in English politics. His sons and grandsons would play increasingly important roles in the struggles between Lancaster and York that dominated 15th century England. Through his descendants, Edmund became the founder of a royal dynasty. Edward, the second Duke of York, inherited his father's political caution but lived in more turbulent times. He supported Henry IV against various rebellions and served Henry V in the French Wars, dying heroically at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. His death without legitimate heirs passed the York title to his nephew Richard, son of Richard of Konigsberg. Richard of Konigsberg had married Anne Mortimer, great-granddaughter of Lionel of Antwerp, through Philippa of Clarence. This marriage united 2 branches of Edward III's bloodline and created a genealogical claim that would eventually challenge Lancastrian legitimacy. Their son Richard would become Duke of York and father of kings. The marriage of Richard of Konigsberg to Anne Mortimer proved pivotal in English dynastic history. Through Anne, the House of York could claim descent from Lionel of Antwerp, Edward III's second surviving son, arguing that this gave them superior hereditary rights compared to the Lancastrian descent from John of Gaunt, the third surviving son. This genealogical argument became the legal foundation for the Yorkist challenge to Lancastrian rule during the Wars of the Roses. Edmund of Langley's grandson Richard, Duke of York, would use his combined descent from Edmund of Langley and Lionel of Antwerp to justify rebellion against Henry VI and claim the English throne. The ultimate vindication of Edmund's line came through his great-grandsons Edward IV and Richard III, who successfully overthrew the Lancastrian dynasty and ruled England from 1461 to 1485. Edward IV's victories at Towton and Tewkesbury established Yorkist control, while his brother Richard III's brief reign ended the medieval period of English kingship. Though the House of York lost the crown at Bosworth Field in 1485, Edmund of Langley's bloodline continued through female descendants who married into other noble families. The York line's genetic legacy survives in numerous English aristocratic families and, through various marriage connections, eventually reached the modern royal family. Edmund of Langley's story illustrates how younger royal sons, initially destined for supporting roles, could become founders of dynasties that would challenge and ultimately replace the senior line. His quiet loyalty and political moderation established a family tradition that his descendants would abandon in their pursuit of the crown he never sought. Blanche of the Tower was born in 1342 at the Tower of London, the eighth child and fourth daughter of Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainault. Her birth at England's most famous fortress gave her a name that would be recorded in royal chronicles despite her brief existence. The princess was born during a period of military preparation as Edward III planned new campaigns in the ongoing struggle with France. The Tower of London served as both royal residence and military headquarters, making it a natural location for the Queen's confinement during these months of intense activity. Blanche received baptism according to royal tradition, with appropriate ceremony befitting a daughter of the reigning king. Contemporary records suggest that the infant appeared healthy at birth, giving her parents reason to hope for another surviving child to strengthen the dynasty and provide future diplomatic opportunities through marriage alliances. Medieval medicine offered limited protection against the diseases and complications that threatened infant life in the 14th century. Even royal children, despite access to the finest physicians and most expensive remedies, faced mortality rates that would shock modern observers. Blanche of the Tower fell victim to these harsh realities before her first birthday. The exact cause of Blanche's death remains unknown, as medieval medical records rarely specified the conditions that killed young children. Royal physicians documented treatments attempted but could not identify specific diseases or provide effective cures for most pediatric ailments. The princess likely died of fever, infection, or one of the numerous childhood diseases that claimed so many medieval lives. Blanche of the Tower died in 1342, probably within months of her birth. Her death represented another loss for Edward III and Queen Philippa, who had already experienced the grief of losing their son William of Hatfield 5 years earlier. The royal couple bore their sorrow privately while maintaining the public dignity expected of monarchs. The infant princess was buried in Westminster Abbey, where her tomb marked her place among the royal family despite her brief life. The memorial demonstrated the respect accorded to all legitimate children of the crown, regardless of age at death. Her burial location reflected her status as a daughter of the reigning king and sister to future rulers. Blanche's name appeared in contemporary chronicles and genealogical records, preserving her memory as part of Edward III's family despite her inability to contribute to dynasty or diplomacy. Medieval chroniclers carefully recorded royal births and deaths, understanding that even brief lives held significance for understanding royal lineages and succession patterns. The loss of another infant daughter may have influenced Queen Philippa's approach to her subsequent pregnancies and childcare arrangements. The Queen had already lost 2 children by 1342, making her acutely aware of the fragility of royal offspring, despite every advantage of rank and wealth. Blanche of the Tower's brief existence exemplifies the harsh demographic realities faced by medieval royal families. High infant mortality affected all social classes, but royal deaths received particular attention because of their potential impact on succession and dynastic stability. Every lost child represented both personal grief and political consequence. Her story serves as a reminder that the impressive number of Edward III's surviving children, 7 who reached adulthood, masked significant losses along the way. For every prince or princess who lived to marry, found dynasties, or influence history, others died as infants, mourned by parents but forgotten by posterity except for brief mentions in royal records. The name Blanche of the Tower survives primarily in genealogical tables and historical footnotes, marking her as one of many medieval royal children whose lives were too brief to leave individual marks on history. Her legacy lies in reminding modern observers of the uncertainties that shaped medieval royal nurseries and influenced parental decisions about surviving children. Contemporary royal families learned to balance hope and grief, celebrating each successful birth while preparing emotionally for potential losses. Blanche of the Tower's death contributed to this education in royal mortality, teaching her parents and siblings that even the mightiest kingdoms could not protect their youngest members from biological vulnerability. Mary of Waltham was born in 1344 at Waltham Abbey in Essex, the ninth child and fifth daughter of Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainault. Her birth at this ancient religious foundation reflected Queen Philippa's devotion to the abbey and her custom of seeking spiritual blessing for her pregnancies at sacred sites. The princess received her early education in the royal nurseries alongside her surviving siblings, learning the skills appropriate for a medieval royal daughter. Her tutors prepared her for eventual marriage to a foreign prince, understanding that her primary value to the crown lay in cementing diplomatic alliances through matrimonial negotiations. Mary's childhood unfolded during the height of Edward III's military successes in France. The victories at Crécy and Calais had established English dominance in the opening phases of the Hundred Years' War, creating opportunities for advantageous marriage alliances that would consolidate English gains and isolate French resistance. In 1361, when Mary reached the age of 17, Edward III arranged her betrothal to John de Montfort, Duke of Brittany. The match served crucial strategic purposes, securing English control over Breton ports and preventing French access to naval bases that threatened English shipping routes between England and Gascony. The marriage negotiations revealed the complex calculations underlying medieval royal matrimony. Mary brought English royal blood and a substantial dowry, while John provided control over strategically vital Breton territories and naval resources. The alliance promised to transform Brittany from a contested region into a reliable English ally. Mary and John de Montfort were married in 1361, with ceremonies conducted both in England and Brittany to emphasize the alliance's importance to both realms. The wedding festivities demonstrated the wealth and power of both families while celebrating the diplomatic coup that brought Brittany firmly into the English sphere of influence. The marriage established Mary as Duchess of Brittany, making her one of the most powerful women in northwestern Europe. Her new duchy controlled crucial trade routes and possessed naval capabilities that could support or threaten English interests depending on political circumstances. Mary's influence extended across Breton politics and diplomacy. The couple established their court at various Breton castles, creating a center of Anglo-Breton culture that reflected Mary's English origins and John's French connections. Their household patronized scholars, artists, and religious institutions, contributing to the cultural flowering that characterized 14th century Breton society. Despite their political success and personal compatibility, Mary and John de Montfort produced no surviving children during their marriage. The absence of heirs created succession difficulties for the Duchy of Brittany and deprived Mary of the maternal role that typically defined medieval noble. Women's lives and political influence. John de Montfort died in 1399, leaving Mary a childless widow in control of the Duchy of Brittany. Her widowhood created complex diplomatic situations as various parties, French, English, and Breton, maneuvered to influence Breton succession and control the duchy's strategic resources for their own purposes. Mary of Waltham died in Brittany in 1404 at the age of approximately 60. She was buried in Breton soil, far from the royal tombs of Westminster Abbey, reflecting the continental life she had chosen through marriage. Her death marked the end of direct English royal control over Breton politics. The absence of children from Mary's marriage meant that the Duchy of Brittany passed to other claimants rather than remaining connected to the English royal family. This succession transferred a valuable strategic asset away from English influence just as the Hundred Years' War entered its most difficult phase for English interests. Mary's story illustrates both the potential and limitations of medieval diplomatic marriages. While her union successfully secured Breton alliance during her lifetime, The lack of heirs meant that the diplomatic gains proved temporary. Her death broke the personal bonds that had sustained Anglo-Breton cooperation throughout her marriage to the Duchess of Brittany left no direct legacy beyond her tomb and her place in genealogical records. No descendants carried her blood forward. No noble house claimed her as ancestress. No political alliance survived her death. Her influence ended with her life, unlike her brothers who founded dynasties that would shape English politics for centuries. Mary of Waltham represents the typical fate of many medieval royal daughters: marriage as a diplomatic instrument, life divided between birth country and adopted homeland, influence limited to a single lifetime without extension through descendants. Her story reminds us that successful diplomacy required not only strategic marriages but also biological success in producing heirs to maintain alliances across generations. Her memory survived primarily in Breton chronicles and English royal records, which preserved her name as part of Edward III's family and as a former Duchess of Brittany. These scattered references constitute the primary evidence for a life that, despite its political importance, left few traces for modern historians to recover and analyze. Margaret of Windsor was born in 1346 at Windsor Castle, the 10th child and 6th daughter of Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainault. Her birth at the royal castle that would become synonymous with English monarchy marked her as another potential diplomatic asset in her father's continuing struggle with France and quest for European alliances. The princess entered the world during one of the most triumphant periods of Edward III's reign. The English victory at Crécy in 1346 had shattered French military confidence and established Edward's reputation as Europe's premier warrior king. Margaret's birth coincided with these celebrations, making her arrival a symbol of English royal fertility and dynastic strength. Margaret received the education appropriate for a royal daughter in the mid-14th century. Her tutors prepared her for eventual marriage to a foreign nobleman, teaching her the languages, customs, and diplomatic skills necessary for successful integration into a foreign court and effective representation of English interests through matrimonial alliance. The princess grew up during the height of English chivalric culture, when Windsor Castle served as the center of Edward III's newly founded Order of the Garter. The court's emphasis on knightly virtue, courtly love, and artistic patronage shaped Margaret's understanding of noble behavior and prepared her for life among Europe's most sophisticated aristocracy. In 1359, Edward III began negotiations for Margaret's marriage to John Hastings, 2nd Earl of Pembroke, one of England's most powerful and wealthy nobles. The proposed match differed from typical royal diplomatic marriages by keeping Margaret within England rather than sending her abroad to cement foreign alliances. The marriage to John Hastings served domestic rather than international political purposes. The Earl controlled vast estates in Wales and Ireland, making him a crucial supporter of royal authority in regions where English control faced constant challenges. Margaret's marriage would strengthen ties between the crown and one of its most important noble families. Margaret and John Hastings were married in 1361 when she was 15 years old. The wedding took place with appropriate ceremony, celebrating the union between royal blood and one of England's premier earldoms. The match elevated Margaret's status while providing the crown with a reliable ally in Welsh and Irish affairs. The marriage established Margaret as Countess of Pembroke, making her one of the wealthiest and most influential noblewomen in Wales and Ireland. Her new position carried significant responsibilities for managing vast estates, maintaining political relationships with local elites, and representing royal interests in regions distant from Westminster. Margaret and John established their household primarily at Pembroke Castle in Wales, though they maintained residences in Ireland and England as well. Their court became a center of Anglo-Welsh culture, patronizing Welsh bards and English scholars while serving as a bridge between different cultural traditions within the English realm. The couple's wealth allowed them to live magnificently and to patronize religious and artistic institutions throughout their territories. Margaret's household sponsored the copying of manuscripts, the construction of religious buildings, and the support of scholars who contributed to the intellectual life of 14th century Wales. Despite their wealth, social position, and apparent personal compatibility, Margaret and John Hastings produced no surviving children during their marriage. This absence of heirs created succession difficulties for the Pembroke estates and deprived Margaret of the maternal role that typically defined noble women's political and social influence. John Hastings died in 1375, leaving Margaret a childless widow at the age of 29. Her widowhood created complex legal and political situations regarding the inheritance of the vast Pembroke estates, as the lack of direct heirs meant that the properties would pass to more distant relatives rather than remaining under Margaret's control. Margaret of Windsor survived her husband by nearly 20 years, living as a wealthy widow with significant social status but diminishing political influence. Her position as a childless dowager countess provided her with financial security but limited her ability to shape political developments or maintain family alliances. Margaret died in 1395 at approximately 49 years of age. She was buried alongside her husband, though the exact location of her tomb remains uncertain to modern historians. Her death marked the end of her connection to the Pembroke earldom and concluded a life that, despite its privileges, left no lasting dynastic legacy. The absence of children from Margaret's marriage meant that her branch of Edward III's family tree ended with her death. No descendants carried her blood forward, no noble house claimed her as ancestress, no political alliance depended on her lineage. Her influence, like that of many medieval noble women, ended with her lifetime. Margaret's story exemplifies the experiences of royal daughters who married within their own kingdoms rather than abroad. While she avoided the cultural displacement faced by sisters who married foreign princes, she also failed to produce the children who might have extended royal influence through domestic noble families. The Countess of Pembroke left no legacy beyond her tomb and her place in royal genealogies. Her wealth, education, and social position could not overcome the fundamental medieval expectation that noble women's primary contribution lay in producing heirs to continue family lines and political alliances. Margaret of Windsor represents the paths not taken in medieval dynastic history, the marriages that failed to produce children, the alliances that ended with death, the bloodlines that terminated rather than branched. Her story reminds us that successful dynasty building required not only strategic planning, but also biological success that remained beyond human control. Her memory survived primarily in the careful records maintained by royal chroniclers, who documented marriages and deaths within the royal family as matters of constitutional importance. These scattered references constitute most of the evidence for a life that, despite its apparent comfort and status, made little lasting impact on English political development. William of Windsor was born in 1348 at Windsor Castle, the 11th child and 6th son of Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainault. His birth occurred during the devastating pandemic of the Black Death, making his arrival both a blessing and a reminder of the mortality that was claiming millions of lives across Europe. The prince was born into a world transformed by plague, where even royal palaces could not guarantee safety from the disease that killed indiscriminately across all social classes. His birth at Windsor Castle, normally a cause for celebration and ceremony, took place amid the somber reality of pandemic conditions that limited both court festivities and public gatherings. William's baptism proceeded according to royal tradition, though the ceremony likely involved fewer attendees than usual due to plague precautions. The infant prince represented hope for dynastic continuity during a period when death seemed to stalk every household, from peasant cottages to royal residences. Medieval medical understanding offered no protection against the diseases and complications that threatened infant life under normal circumstances, and the ongoing plague pandemic created additional hazards for vulnerable newborns. Royal physicians could provide expensive remedies and constant attention, but their treatments remained largely ineffective against most pediatric ailments. The Black Death's impact on royal households extended beyond direct mortality to encompass disrupted routines, reduced staff, and general anxiety about health and survival. Even within the relative safety of Windsor Castle, the royal family remained acutely aware of the pandemic's presence and its potential to claim any member of the household. William of Windsor died in 1348, probably within months of his birth and possibly as a direct or indirect victim of the plague pandemic that was devastating Europe. His death represented another loss for Edward III and Queen Philippa, who had already experienced the grief of losing multiple children during their marriage. The infant prince was buried with appropriate ceremony, though records of his interment remain sparse compared to documentation surrounding the funerals of adult royalty. His burial likely took place at Windsor Castle or Westminster Abbey, marking his place among the royal family despite his brief existence. William's death occurred during the same period that claimed his sister Joan of England, who died of plague in Bordeaux while traveling to her wedding in Castile. The loss of two royal children within months of each other demonstrated that even the mightiest kingdoms could not protect their most precious members from pandemic disease. The prince's brief life coincided with one of medieval Europe's most traumatic periods, when the Black Death killed approximately one-third of the continent's population between 1347 and 1351. His birth and death became part of the larger story of how plague affected every level of society, from peasants to princes. Contemporary chroniclers recorded William's birth and death as part of their systematic documentation of royal family events, understanding that even brief lives held genealogical significance. These records preserved his memory despite his inability to contribute to dynasty, diplomacy, social, or political development. William of Windsor's story illustrates the intersection of royal history with broader demographic catastrophe. His life, though brief, unfolded during one of the most significant events in medieval European history, making him both a victim of plague and a symbol of royal vulnerability during crisis periods. The loss of another infant son reinforced for Edward III and Queen Philippa the precarious nature of medieval royal succession, even for families blessed with numerous children. Each death reminded them that dynastic security required not only political skill and military success, but also simple biological survival. William's name appeared in genealogical records and royal chronicles as evidence of Edward III's fertility and as a reminder of the mortality that shaped medieval royal families. His brief existence became part of the statistical foundation upon which historians calculate medieval infant mortality rates and assess demographic patterns. The prince left no legacy beyond his place in royal family trees and his contribution to our understanding of how plague affected royal households. No descendants carried his name forward, no noble house claimed him as founder, no political alliance hinged on his survival. William of Windsor represents the statistical reality behind medieval royal fertility, that high birth rates accompanied high infant mortality rates, requiring royal couples to produce many children to ensure that sufficient numbers survived to provide succession security and diplomatic opportunities through marriage alliances. His memory survived primarily through the careful record-keeping practices of royal clerks and chroniclers, who understood that documenting births and deaths within the royal family served important constitutional and genealogical purposes. These fragments constitute the primary evidence for lives too brief to generate extensive historical documentation. Thomas of Woodstock was born on January 7, 1355, at Woodstock Palace in Oxfordshire, the 12th and youngest child of Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainault. His birth marked the end of Queen Philippa's remarkable fertility, concluding a quarter-century of royal childbearing that had produced one of medieval Europe's most influential royal generations. The prince entered a world where his elder brothers had already established themselves as major political and military figures. Edward of Woodstock commanded English forces in France, John of Gaunt controlled the vast Duchy of Lancaster, and Edmund of Langley was beginning his rise to ducal status. Thomas would need to find his own path to prominence in a family already rich with accomplished sons. Thomas received the comprehensive education appropriate for a royal son, though his position as youngest child meant that his career options remained more flexible than those of his elder brothers. He mastered Latin, French, military arts, and statecraft, proving himself an intelligent and capable student who could match his brother's intellectual achievements. The prince's early military career began during the later phases of the 100 Years' War, when English fortunes in France were beginning to decline from the heights achieved during his father's reign. Thomas served competently in various campaigns, though he never achieved the legendary reputation that marked his eldest brother's career. In 1376, Thomas married Eleanor de Bohun, co-heiress to the earldom of Hereford and one of the wealthiest heiresses in England. The marriage brought Thomas vast estates and the resources necessary to maintain the magnificent lifestyle expected of royal dukes. Eleanor's inheritance made him one of England's premier nobles. The marriage proved both politically advantageous and personally successful. Eleanor brought not only wealth, but also important connections to established noble families who could provide political support and military resources. Their combined assets allowed them to establish a household that rivaled those of Thomas's elder brothers in magnificence and influence. In 1385, Richard II created Thomas as Duke of Gloucester, completing Edward III's systematic elevation of his surviving sons to ducal rank. The new title reflected both Thomas's growing political importance and the need to provide him with status appropriate to his royal birth and marriage wealth. Thomas and Eleanor had 4 surviving children who would carry their bloodline into the 15th century and beyond. Anne of Gloucester married Edmund Stafford, 5th Earl of Stafford, linking the royal line to one of England's most powerful noble families. Humphrey of Gloucester inherited his father's title and political ambitions. Joan of Gloucester and Isabella of Gloucester married into other noble families, spreading royal blood throughout the English aristocracy. The Duke of Gloucester's political career was marked by increasing opposition to his nephew Richard II's policies and personal rule. Thomas emerged as a leader of the baronial opposition that criticized the young king's favorites, financial policies, and perceived weakness in foreign affairs. This opposition would ultimately define his legacy and determine his fate. In 1387, Thomas joined with other disaffected nobles to form the Lords Appellant, a group that challenged Richard II's authority and demanded reforms to royal government. The Lords Appellant accused the king's favorites of treason and threatened military action if their demands were not met. Their rebellion represented the most serious challenge to royal authority since the reign of Edward II. The conflict between the Lords Appellant and Richard II reached its climax in 1388 at the Merciless Parliament, where Thomas and his allies successfully purged the royal court of officials they considered corrupt or treasonous. Several of the king's closest advisors were executed, while others fled into exile to escape baronial vengeance. The Lords Appellant's victory proved temporary. Richard II spent the next decade carefully rebuilding his power while appearing to accept the constraints imposed by the rebellious nobles. By 1397, the king felt strong enough to strike back against his former tormentors, beginning a campaign of revenge that would destroy several of his uncle's allies. Thomas of Woodstock was arrested at Pleshy Castle in Essex on July 10, 1397, on charges of treason against the crown. The arrest came without warning, giving the Duke no opportunity to gather supporters or organize resistance. He was taken under guard to Calais, where he would await trial for his role in the Lords Appellant rebellion. The Duke never faced trial. Thomas of Woodstock died in Calais in September 1397, almost certainly murdered on Richard II's orders, though the exact circumstances remain disputed by historians. Contemporary sources suggested smothering, poisoning, or other forms of assassination, though the king's supporters claimed natural death. Thomas's murder shocked contemporary observers and marked a turning point in Richard II's reign toward increasingly tyrannical behavior. The execution of a royal duke without trial violated medieval concepts of noble privilege and royal justice, alienating even nobles who had not supported the Lords Appellant rebellion. The Duke of Gloucester's death created martyrdom that would haunt Richard II for the remainder of his reign. Thomas became a symbol of resistance to royal tyranny, and his memory inspired continuing opposition to the king's policies. His murder contributed to the political instability that would ultimately enable Henry Bolingbroke's successful usurpation in 1399. Thomas's legacy lived on through his children, who carried both royal blood and grievances against the crown into the 15th century. The Stafford family, through marriage to Anne of Gloucester, inherited claims to royal descent that would later support their elevation to ducal status and their involvement in the Wars of the Roses. Humphrey of Gloucester briefly inherited his father's title and political ambitions, but died without male heirs in 1399. The Gloucester title eventually passed to other branches of the royal family, though Thomas's female descendants continued to carry his bloodline into numerous noble families throughout England. The Stafford connection proved particularly significant in later English history. Thomas's daughter Anne carried royal blood into a family that would produce the Dukes of Buckingham, who played major roles in the Wars of the Roses and Tudor politics. The Stafford's royal descent, traced through Thomas of Woodstock, provided genealogical justification for their political ambitions and noble status. Through his descendants, Thomas of Woodstock's bloodline survived the immediate consequences of his rebellion and murder to influence English politics for generations. His legacy included not only his own political career, but also the ongoing impact of his children's marriages and their descendants' continued involvement in struggles for power and royal favor. The youngest son of Edward III thus became, paradoxically, both a symbol of resistance to royal tyranny and an ancestor of families who would serve future kings. His violent death at Richard II's hands made him a martyr to noble privilege, while his bloodline continued to shape English aristocratic society long after his political ambitions had been crushed by royal vengeance. The 12 children of Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainault created the genetic and political foundation for every major dynastic struggle in later medieval English history. From a single royal nursery at Windsor Castle emerged the bloodlines that would produce the Wars of the Roses, the Tudor dynasty, and the modern House of Windsor. 7 of Edward III's children survived to adulthood and established lasting legacies. Edward of Woodstock founded the legend of warrior kingship, but left only the doomed Richard II to carry his line. Isabella and Mary married into continental nobility, carrying English royal blood into French and Breton aristocracy. Margaret remained in England but died without heirs, ending her branch of the family tree. The 3 surviving sons who founded ducal houses, Lionel of Antwerp, John of Gaunt, and Edmund of Langley, became the ancestors of every subsequent claimant to the English throne. Lionel's daughter, Philippa of Clarence, carried his blood into the House of York through the Mortimer line. John of Gaunt founded the House of Lancaster and, through his legitimized Beaufort children, the Tudor dynasty. Edmund of Langley established the House of York, whose descendants would overthrow the Lancastrians and rule England until 1485. The complex inheritance patterns created by these marriages and bloodlines turned Edward III's family success into England's dynastic nightmare. The Wars of the Roses began as disputes between great-grandsons of Edward III, each claiming superior hereditary right to the throne their ancestor had secured. The Lancastrian kings, descended from John of Gaunt, faced challenges from Yorkist claimants who traced their superior genealogical position through both Edmund of Langley and Lionel of Antwerp. Thomas of Woodstock's violent end demonstrated the dangers inherent in royal blood when combined with political ambition. His murder by Richard II illustrated how family relationships could not protect royal relatives from the consequences of rebellion. Yet his descendants through the Stafford marriage would continue to play major roles in English politics, carrying both royal blood and memories of royal injustice into future generations. The 5 children who died in infancy, William of Hatfield, Joan of England, Blanche of the Tower, William of Windsor, remind us that medieval royal fertility required numerous births to ensure adequate survival rates. Their brief lives and early deaths shaped their parents' understanding of royal mortality and influenced their treatment of surviving children. Each loss made the survivors more precious and their eventual accomplishments more remarkable. Even the children who left no direct descendants contributed to the broader pattern of Edward III's dynastic success. Isabella's marriage strengthened Anglo-French cultural connections, Mary's union secured Breton alliance, and Margaret's match consolidated royal relationships with powerful English noble families. Their stories illustrate the multiple roles played by royal daughters in medieval diplomacy and politics. The genetic legacy of Edward III's children extends far beyond their immediate political impact. Modern genealogical research demonstrates that their bloodlines flow through virtually every major English noble family and, through various marriage connections, into the current British royal family. Queen Elizabeth II could trace multiple lines of descent back to Edward III through different children, making her a genetic inheritor of this remarkable medieval dynasty. The European royal families also carry the blood of Edward III's children through various marriage alliances that connected English royalty to continental dynasties. The diplomatic marriages arranged by Edward III created genetic links that survive today in the royal houses of Spain, Belgium, the Netherlands, and other European monarchies. Perhaps most remarkably, the political and constitutional changes initiated by Edward III's children continue to influence British government today. The parliamentary traditions established during the conflicts between Richard II and the Lords Appellant, the precedents set by Henry IV's usurpation, and the legal principles developed during the War of the Roses all contributed to the evolution of English constitutional monarchy. The children of Edward III transformed medieval England from a kingdom dependent on a single royal line into a realm where multiple branches of royal blood competed for supremacy. This competition, though destructive in the short term, ultimately strengthened English monarchy by forcing each claimant to demonstrate both genealogical legitimacy and practical competence in governance. Their story reminds us that individual lives, however brief or seemingly insignificant, can shape historical development in ways that extend far beyond personal achievement or failure. The infant who died at Windsor Castle, the princess who perished of plague in Bordeaux, the duke murdered in Calais, each played a role in creating the complex genetic and political inheritance that defined English royal succession for centuries. Today, more than 6.5 centuries after the last of Edward III's children died, their bloodlines still flow through European royalty and aristocracy. Their political innovations still influence British constitutional development. Their cultural patronage still enriches our understanding of medieval civilization. Their family quarrels still echo in the histories of the Wars of the Roses and the Tudor triumph. The royal nursery at Windsor and Woodstock, once filled with the voices of 12 princes and princesses, emptied long ago. But the dynasty they created together, through their marriages, their children, their ambitions, and their failures, continues to shape the royal families and constitutional traditions of modern Europe. In the end, Edward III's children achieved a form of immortality that transcends individual life or death. They became the ancestors of nations and the founders of traditions that endure to this day.